So today we're supposed to talk about some of the causes or reasons why human rights are violated. And I think it has to do with human nature in some aspects, and also how that human nature or the ways in which we think can be manipulated. But for review, let's first focus on the fact that humans work in groups and we benefit from cooperating with each other. And when we cooperate with each other, the level to which we cooperate with each other, the level to which we cooperate depends on whether we feel that it's fair. So fairness is important. If we feel that our participation is fair, then we're more invested. And that's what human rights protects. Human rights protects dignity and fairness. And so you would think that if cooperation is good for the individual and cooperation is also good for the group, that we should know already that we should treat people fairly and respect each other's rights, because what's good for the group is good for me. So why is it that we do have violations of rights and violations of dignity? So one thing is that the way that we learned to think or understand our reality is through categorization. So we learned about our reality by deciding what's dangerous and what's not dangerous. We have new experiences or we learn new things and we compare them to what we've known before. So is this the same as that thing, or is this different from that thing? So the way that we think and the way that we actually evolve to have consciousness of ourselves is by building this construct about things that are the same and different. And we see that we are an individual, the same as but different than everyone else. The problem comes when we reduce everything to what's called binary thinking, which is thinking in terms of opposites. So even though we think in terms of night and day and black and white, we know that that's false, because day is 24 hours, including night, and it's so many minutes and so many seconds. And we know that we don't see black and white, we see color, and we know that color is a spectrum, it's a continuum, and that shades of color integrate into each other. So even though we think in terms of opposites, it's actually a bad way of thinking. And we do this with groups. We do the same thing in terms of opposites. We think of the group that we're part of, and in order for there to be a group, we have to exclude someone. So others have to be outside the group. There is no group for us to cooperate inside if there's no one else outside. So this dynamic of groups being defined as opposites is what creates for the dehumanization of others, which allows us to actually subjugate others, allows us to think that others are less. It creates hierarchy. This was explored by Edward Said in Orientalism, where he showed that Europe had to define itself by defining its opposite. So Europe created stories about the rest of the world. And Europe said that the rest of the world is romantic and not logical, because we're logical. So this idea of always defining ourselves by defining the other creates hierarchy, and it creates for exclusion. And so we've seen this manifest in many different ways. In language, we have hai and odar, very common in the diaspora. So this idea that there's one identity, it's not the other identities. We have this in terms of defining, looking for others. We start to look for the opposite. So we see red-haired people who are a minority in the world, and we start to see that they're different. So in order to make a group which is natural and normal, we exclude them as the different. This is very common with left-handed people. So 10% of the world is left-handed, and it always has been and it always will be. But during the Middle Ages and even in the 19th century and up until the recent times, being left-handed was associated as being wrong because it was the opposite of the majority. So what we see is that the majority defines itself as natural, defines itself as normal, and looks for something opposite. And something opposite is what we use to distinguish ourselves. So this is like one of the ways in which our thinking leads to discrimination, and it creates hierarchy. Now, this also is embedded in things like man and woman, or men and women. So we define the man as the opposite of the woman, and we define the woman as the opposite of the man. And we like to think that there's just these two categories and that they're opposites. It's an easy definition. But yet, even in Armenian culture, we have Tagha Martkin. We have the woman who is successful in a man's world. But instead of recognizing that this means that individuals cross the spectrum, we say, oh, this is the exception to the rule, because we'd rather hold on to our definitions than to recognize that everything is a spectrum. So this framework of distinction and group building, it causes hierarchy, it causes exclusion, it is the root of colonialization, and it leads to scapegoating. So whenever an individual or a society lives a contradiction, then they need to resolve that contradiction. This is cognitive dissonance. So for Europe during colonization, it had to have a reason why it needed to dominate others. So it had to rationalize that it's bringing civilization, that it's bringing law, that it's bringing norms, that it's bringing logic. So it had to rationalize that it was bringing something to the people that it was actually dominating. And we have this also in our own reality with Pan-Turkism, because Turkey has a contradiction. It claims to be a conqueror. It claims the glory of conquest coming from Central Asia to here. But why does it belong here if it's from somewhere else? So in order to resolve the contradiction, it engages in the opposites, and it has to have an opposite. So Armenians, as a native indigenous population, are the opposite, and they become the ones that need to be actually eliminated in order for Turks to claim both to have belonging and to be from somewhere else. So their contradiction is that you're from somewhere else, yet you belong here. So if someone else belongs here also, you have to resolve that contradiction. So Pan-Turkism is this idea that they're uniting Turks. And the ideology is that if you're uniting Turks, then no one else is here. Because if there's other people here, then you're not uniting Turks. So the ideology of Pan-Turkism, it has a contradiction. And it plays on the notions that we have of dividing ourselves into groups. What I want to say is that there comes a point where, to some extent, our group building and our making of differences and our discrimination becomes scapegoating when we need to resolve a conflict. And we scapegoated redhead people. We scapegoated left-handed people. We scapegoat different ethnic minorities. And we say that they are the problem. So this has a root that is natural in a way, but it's also manipulated. So the manipulation is all around us. The manipulation of this binary thinking or thinking in opposites. So, for example, Aliyev and his regime don't provide anything to the people. So they have to provide them with glory. So they have to provide them with this idea of conquest. Erdogan is ruling over a failed economy. His regime doesn't do anything for average people. So he has to provide them glory. He has to provide them empire. And it's the same for the Russian oligarchy. The Russian oligarchy, it needs to expand. It needs to convince its population that it's protecting them from the foreign enemy and that it's providing them with prosperity, not in any economic way, but in terms of expansion. So all of these ideas can be manipulated by those who are in power. The divide and rule is another manipulation of this phenomena, dividing ourselves into groups, or those who exercise power always want to divide us into groups. And if we look at Sakharov, he said that the Soviet Union was imperialistic, based on imperialistic borders. The borders were false, and that the borders actually were meant to create conflict. And that conflict is founded in this notion of groups. What would happen if we all cooperated? If we all cooperated, then we wouldn't need them. So this is the point, that those who have power, they only have power when they convince you that you need them. You need them when you cannot solve your problems yourselves. So if we could solve our problems ourselves through cooperating with others, then we would take away the need for anyone else. We would take away the need to engage with Russia. So the divide and rule is premised on that. Now, so one thing is that we have the thinking in opposites, the division into groups, the hierarchical aspect of that, which leads to the scapegoating of minority groups or less powerful groups. And we need to blame them for their presence. Blame them because they are not natural, because they are not normal, because the bigger group is normal. And we have the manipulation of all of that, whereby those who in power need to create conflict so that they are needed to resolve the conflict. And we have another thing, which is distraction. So we have serious problems to deal with as humanity. We have global warming, we have climate change. And instead of dealing with those issues, we are distracted. And while we're distracted, those who profit from continuing problems with the climate, from the ongoing, from the failure to resolve the climate change, there are those who profit from it. So they would rather have us distracted about other issues. For example, this issue about LGBT people. There is discrimination against LGBT people. Why? Because they're different, because they're in the spectrum, because the opposites are men and women. So that there's a person that doesn't fit within one category solely ruins the dynamic of patriarchy, which is men and women as opposites. Now, why is that a threat? Why would it be a threat to recognize equal rights and equal dignity for 5% of the population? If someone is confident in their own sexual orientation, then why do they care about anyone else's sexual orientation? So the point here is that 5% of the population is not a threat. Recognizing dignity and rights for 5% of the population does not destroy your dignity and rights. Actually, we see that it's the right that needs to be upheld for everyone so that it exists for you also. So what this is, I think, is a distraction. It's a way to keep you busy with other things instead of focusing on the fact that there's an international oligarchy that controls most states. Most states are controlled by their oligarchies. People who have money and influence have extreme amount of power in any state. And we're not addressing that issue. We're not addressing poverty. We're not addressing global climate change. So opposite thinking allows us to be manipulated by those who want to divide us and distract us.